Okay. Hi, Fred. Thanks for
Hi,
being
Andrea.
here.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I
Okay,
really appreciate you taking some time to talk about consciousness and cognition a little bit today.
great stuff. They're both big words, complicated words, and they're very different words.
Indeed. So maybe we'll just let it get messy today.
And but get messy.
Okay, so I just want to ask you a little bit about your trajectory. I know a little bit about it. I think you've been in many different countries. I think at some point you were a nurse. I even think you might have studied with Douglas Hofstadter. Could that be? Whose
Yeah.
book you have just right behind me?
Which book do you have there by Douglas?
I have Gödel Escherbach, which is very
Yeah,
important, and Strange Loops. I have
yeah.
both.
I've both of those and several others. I have a lovely book by him called Le Tombeau de Marot, which
Oh,
is on translation and includes hundreds of translations of one rather weak French poem, but it's an excellent vehicle for exploring the
oh,
mystery
really?
of
I didn't know
translation.
that.
Very, very good. Yeah, Doug was really important to me. I was a nurse in the 80s, and I read Gödel Escherbach and decided, oh, the hell with it, I'm going to have a look at this cognitive science thing. I'm going back to college, and there was no cognitive science degree, so I did computer science and linguistics together, which was possible. And then I had the good fortune to go to Indiana University, take classes with Doug, get to know him, but Indiana University was a hotbed. We're talking now in the 90s, early 90s. And everyone was into dynamics. We were all going to clarify everything because cognitive science was a mess as usual. And we were going to clarify it by using dynamics, where everyone else was arguing about good old-fashioned artificial intelligence versus sub-symbolic processing and connectionist networks.
Oh,
And
wow.
we just discovered this new mathematics, nonlinear
Maybe you can
dynamics.
paint this a little bit, because for me, this is a really interesting time. The 90s, before there was really such a thing as the cognitive science department and the neuroscience department, although they existed, right? And yeah, when
Yeah,
you say it was a hotbed of what? And dynamic, you mean like dynamic systems, all of that was getting started, right? That was kind of what
yeah.
everyone's
Well,
interested.
Indiana University had a particular flavor to it at that time. It had a highly interdisciplinary program with a lot of really great faculty, but distributed all over many different departments. And what they, in order to sort of give a common esprit de corps, I suppose, to the cognitive science community, dynamics was the thing. We were attuned to, aware of the emerging results in nonlinear dynamics, chaos theory, fractal theory, attractors, strange attractors, chaos, catastrophe theory, all these things, because new results were coming out in an unbelievable fire hose. But we didn't know what to do with them. So we were doing connectionist modeling like everyone else, which was kind of the spirit of the times. But we were coming at them with the tools of dynamical systems, looking at recurrences, recurrent networks, their evolution over time. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. We were making but a seat of our pants. Our professors didn't know their dynamics either, and the students were teaching the professors, and it was all a bit of a mess. And it didn't become, as we thought it would, a rallying cry for cognitive science, just because cognitive science pulls in too many different directions. There never will be one rallying cry. But it did turn out to represent a huge contribution that has been made use of by all those vast areas of cognitive science that are not committed to understanding mind as software, shall we say, as representational software doing computations. There's vast other areas of cognitive science that creeps into every area, as it should do. And yeah, uh, that was pretty much it. I got my PhD in '97, did a couple of postdocs, one in Evanston, Illinois, and one in an artificial intelligence lab in Switzerland. And I came back here and have been sort of running the cognitive science program here ever since. We have a small little program, idiosyncratic in character. I think every cognitive science program is idiosyncratic in character. It's going to depend on who's responsible for trying to hold these horses together that are pulling in so many different directions.
I want to know what you think of as cognitive science, because I want to lead into like this idea of cognitive. Kind of
In a
an
word,
impossible question.
it's
It's
perfectly
been
answerable.
everywhere.
It's answerable with a single word: epistemology. And when I took over the cognitive science program, the program had been set up the year before I arrived, and it described cognitive science as the creation of computational models of internal mental processes. So I had to scrap all the propaganda from the department entirely, and I choose to describe it now in a term that makes it clear that the enterprise is not born in 1973, is not born in 1945, but has many thousand-year-old history, which is the relationships between knower, known, and the means of knowing. Those three together, the knower, the known, and the means of knowing. Now, when you articulate it like that, it allows you to make contact with this kind of, must be said, narcissistic inquiry. What kind of a thing am I? What is knowledge to me? What could I know? It makes contact with a lot of ancient philosophies and a lot of philosophies in different traditions. You'll find this articulation, knower, known, means of knowing. You'll find it in Indian religious formations. You'll find it in Judaism. You'll find it in the Arab world. It's one of the ways that many questions around God have been developed. Any question around the nature of the human is going to be very close to questions around God, because we like to think, well, we've a habit of thinking of ourselves as semi-divine, let's say.
Do you think that that has to do with the way that we come to recognize that there is those three parts? This understanding of nature or God or something, and having some kind of dialogue with the world helps you understand that you can have a dialogue with yourself?
Yeah, well, it doesn't clarify things to use those three terms, knower, known, and means of knowing. What it does, it makes it clear that any further inquiry will require you to make some specifications to say what the hell you think you're talking about. What do you mean by knowledge? What do you mean by a knower? What do you mean by the acquisition or exhibition or having of knowledge? All too often, of course, in classical cognitive science, the knower has been assumed to be the psychological subject, the individual person as constructed within some discipline like cognitive psychology. Casting it in that maximally general fashion allows you to consider other ways in which you might consider the knower. It could be collective, could be animal, not necessarily the individual person. I basically tried very hard to keep cognitive science away from the premature specification of the individual or of the person. Whether a person is an individual, I don't know. I think a person more as something that we co-construct out of mutual respect and recognition without any essentialization. So when I say person, I don't mean human, and I don't mean so many other things that we get mistaken for. I don't mean system, organism, or animal. The cognitive science literature very often doesn't know what it's talking about.
Well, here's where it gets very messy for me, and so what I'm sort of trying to figure out. So, we don't want to make this distinction of the individual or the subject or the knower in some kind of absolute sense, which is actually the way we do in daily life. Kind of, we assume there's a self, there are these boundaries, right, and that it's some kind of clear thing. And the more you dig into this from whatever angle, whether it's philosophical, scientific, or spiritual, to be honest, you start to find that dissolves.
Yeah.
So that's where we kind of are, but we still need to talk about it. So when you set something forth like the knower, the known, and how it's known, what was the three things again?
Means of knowing.
Means of knowing. Right. For me, that makes a lot of sense in terms of something like critical thinking, like starting to understand this process, clarifying, being able to communicate. It's really important in the way that science and philosophy are really important, and the way critical thinking is really important. But where's that balance, right? Where you can understand that there is no knower, there is no individual, and yet you're creating this kind of almost what I think of as a representational system, something that is kind of like a drawing or something, a thing that we can both look at and understand. How do you not get it confused, and how do you like think about that or teach that? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's frustrating sometimes for students to approach things in quite this general fashion. But what we then do is, as we home in on this body of work or that body of work or this form of inquiry, these experiments and these findings, if we recognize that we've contracted this question, we've ruled out several options, and we're choosing to focus on this. We're going to assume, let's say, the psychological subject, or we're just an uncomplicated everyday version of the person, for example. We can assume that, but it makes us aware that we're doing that, and that our discourse thereafter is contracted, and it's relevant to a delimited situation. Just as the terms that I use when talking in a hardware store are different than the terms that I use when talking to the doctor.
Yeah, I would call it a landscape. You're sort of setting forth what the parameters are.
Yeah.
Would you consider it like close to something like Dan Dennett would call the intentional stance or something like that, or do you?
No, Dan Dennett's intentional stance is one of the things we have to play with.
Okay.
In general, I'm not looking for answers.
You're not looking for answers.
No.
What are you? Are you looking for anything?
I'm trying to improve my questioning. I'm trying to stare. I stare at the world as people. And I'm trying to improve the quality of the staring to see more.
Why? What does that do? That
It
keeps
draws
you
me.
interested in it.
Well, who wouldn't be interested in it? You want to see what's coming into being, and that includes your own coming into being.
Yeah, I agree. It's
whatever way you choose to cash that out.
It's not only seeing, it's sensing, I guess, too. It's
you see
hearing, being, feeling, all of that, right?
Maximally in a noetic sense rather than the trite manner in which visual perception is discussed in cognitive science.
But how do you see that as relating to this tripartite kind of thing of, is that, and the dynamics that we mentioned at the beginning, because it's kind of a process, isn't it? And the more you stare at something with all your senses, the more you become alive in a weird way, and the more you also lose your boundaries. So it's at least in my experience, I don't know about in yours, but.
Well, I sent a few people a Christmas card, and I kind of like sending Christmas cards. There we go. I said, behold the cognitive sciences, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, computer science, mathematics, linguistics, anthropology, semiotics. The list is extensive and incomplete because this field takes upon its ambitious shoulders the task of knowing about knowing, of speaking in a scientific register about the mysteries of knower, known, and means of knowing. Notice that I've already factored in the fact that science is only going to have partial answers here. Nobody entrusted this sacred charge to an established authority with a proven track record. Nobody granted a motley crew of naive researchers the license to make pronouncements upon the constitution of the person, its relations, its possessions, inhabitations, spirits and soul, its possibilities, ecstasies and terrors. Yet here they come, fresh-faced and eager, pens at the ready, degrees and certificates in hand. Who has the arrogance to call themselves a cognitive scientist? So I think it's necessary in the cognitive sciences to realize that you're being that arrogant, in the hope that you might be a bit more humble. Pronouncements, other people are all too willing to tell you who you are. I don't like that.
Well, doesn't it have to do with that we have this kind of feeling that everything is a bit chaotic if we don't hold to some kind of something definite? Of course, it changes the more you study, and as philosophers, we try to figure out ways of finding our balance in this world. But if I'm thinking of me as a young student, when I was a first student, or one of your, I don't know if you teach first year, but an early student where it can almost be really jarring to understand that.
Yes, I mean the way in which we've now been discussing it is not going to be the basis for an undergraduate class.
How would you start? How would
approach
you
different
ease
classes
people into it?
ways. I'll tell you what I do in an undergraduate class. I use the same graphic on the board in every single lecture as we survey a vast range of topics. On the one hand, I contrast the vertical and the horizontal axis. And I say this vertical axis is our aspirations. It's us believing the best we can be. It's going to be rationalism. It's going to lead to the idea of man as a distinguished species. And it's going to run right through all of you'll never get away from it. It's going to be there the whole time. And horizontally is the qualified ignorance of the empiricist. Since Darwin, we're forced to recognize ourselves as within the natural order and not outside it. And we frankly don't know what to do with that. It's an enormous challenge. And I say this tension we'll accept this tension. It's going to be there. We're going to uncover stories and we'll spot, oh, that's the aspirational being. I mean, Chomsky and Descartes are the two most vertical people here, for example. Whereas embodied cognitive science, that doesn't have answers to most of the questions people want because they actually want psychology and not cognitive science. It's going to be a little bit less sure of itself. And together with that, I give them a timeline with 3 dates. 1600, just so we can point to the approximate onset of scientific modernity. Undergraduate students have no sense of time. They don't know any history. So 1600, we can point to Rene Descartes and we can say we're talking about science when science became a thing, as it were. 1850, we point to the death of God and Charles Darwin. And we say this is the point at which the Industrial Revolution changes everyone's lives. Prior to this, God has to be in the discussion. You cannot have a theory, a natural theory, but it's not compatible with the dominant political theology. After this, you can no longer appeal to God in your science, because you won't get published in science if you appeal to God. So it's a real watershed. And the third date I point to is 1945, which I think should be year zero. That's the atomic bomb, just in case we were thinking science just produces good things. And it's also the end of the cataclysm of the first half of the 20th century. And at that point, man as an ideal figure should be dead. We still encounter this dream of man characterizing human nature. It's always man. And I don't try and pretend that making that gender neutral is going to change its silliness. But that's when the cybernetic era is born. And I point out that they all think and speak a language that is entirely new, that was born after 1945, the language of information processing, communication, control, and computation. And that's their natural language. They think of themselves using this. But it's important to point it out that when we're talking about, I don't know, mind's perception, the human stuff, these ideas are much, 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 much older. And if they are expressed in a modern idiom, that is just a re-expression of old questions. It's not that we finally figured out who we were once we discovered computers in 1945 or something like that. That would be silly. So that periodization and the acknowledgement of the tension between our aspirational being and our epistemic humility, that's how I structure things in the undergraduate class. It allows me to bounce around and show that this theory is useful in this way and show how thinking changes, for example. Like we keep coming back to the 1980s as the peak of computational thinking, when genes become code, become nature, and people are going around looking for a language gene and they're separating identical twins at birth and all this insanity, which is tied to a very specific period, 1980s, around about. And I point to paradoxes, puzzles, and perplexities of our contemporary situation. And I say, I point out that the naive reliance on the computational metaphor has worn off somewhat. Although we think and are engaged in building a world using contemporary means, that there's room for lots of alternatives then. And that's what I try to do, is to leave them room for lots of alternatives.
Yeah, that's a good approach. I can see myself getting hooked by thinking of it like that. But now coming back to where we are, there's something about it that I want to not push you on, but just ask you about, because that's kind of linear, right? And you started talking about dynamics.
Yes. Well, we were talking about teaching undergraduates. You have to,
exactly. I know.
You're simplifying.
So we have to start there. That's kind of, we don't have to, but that's where we are usually. That's the way the world is kind of assuming things move linearly. And there's, I mean, the way you laid it out, you could imagine there's a kind of progression, though I don't think you'd probably say it's necessarily like a progression. It's a change, right?
No, I only use these landmarks because they're relevant to everything we discuss.
Yeah, but that's what I want to get at. Why is it relevant? It clearly is. Is it a change in the way, like how do you see that change in it's a change in thinking, it's a change in the tools, it's a change in society. There's a millions of ways we could look at it, right? But if we're just thinking of it as cognition, a change of cognition, I'm like wondering how how you think about that.
What's cognition?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at, because I could have also asked consciousness. Is it the change of consciousness? Is it a
No,
change
no,
of
no, no.
awareness of others? It's a
Okay,
change of,
now we have to keep those words separate.
yeah.
Consciousness and cognition should not be confused with each other, but they
I'm
are
so
in
glad
most
you
people's
said that.
minds.
Yeah.
They are in most people's minds because cognition makes you think, my mind, my thinking, my consciousness.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
then when that word gets elaborated, particularly in the scientific register, but not only, it becomes instead the means to solve problems, the means of achieving goals, of overcoming that. And that has nothing to do with consciousness whatsoever.
Well, this is the way cognition is often used as thinking, which means problem solving.
It's an instrument.
Emotions aren't usually counted in there. Motivations aren't usually
We
counted.
mean much more by cognition than we cash out.
Yeah.
When we treat it in the literature, we treat it as if it was problem solving. And we talk of, I mean, that's how we talk about ourselves. For example, if you're getting a bit older like me, you might speak of cognitive decline. And what does that mean? It means you're not meeting some standards. You're failing to meet some standards. You're failing at some task. And to fail at a task, no animal has ever failed at a task. Only humans fail at tasks because only humans invent the concept of failure. So we've invented this self bondage of goals we need to meet in order to be cognitively intact, shall we say. Now, consciousness is not that. What consciousness is, I certainly cannot answer. But I can say that I have looked at more than the scientific literature, and the scientific literature knows nothing of consciousness. There is expertise in consciousness. This has been handled in spiritual traditions and philosophical traditions because those are not cleanly separable. It's only in Europe where philosophy and theology and our particular political developments that had the churches and the state and all those religious wars, it's only from here that you would choose to separate philosophy, theology, in general, good living, advice for good living, good thinking. But when you review human thinking in a larger sense, you find consciousness has been a theme, has been thematized. In very many cases, what is meant by consciousness is nothing less than God. And then the individual will be a contraction of that. So a contraction of something much larger. But then we are in theological grounds here. Everyone likes to throw tomatoes at Descartes, but I don't see him as theologically relevant. And he was trying to clear a space for, religious wars were raging during his entire life. He was clearing a space for rational thinking. I have great fondness for Descartes, and I'm not a fan of throwing tomatoes at him, as most people seem to do. I'm still trying to understand what I should think of René Descartes. And that's actually where I'm going next in my work.
Oh.
Yeah, but it's not the cogito I'm interested in. It's the zero on the coordinate plane, which is the same thing as the cogito. Interesting. When you spot it as being the same thing as the cogito and you realize it changed mathematics, you realize, hang on, things, consciousness and maths and everything have got totally mixed up. He's certainly not doing psychology, you see. We tend to mock something we understand as Cartesian dualism, that thinking stuff and the extended stuff. And we say, look, Descartes has this thought bubble mind. It's a secret interiority. Descartes didn't do that. We've done that in the wake of Descartes in developing stories of the individual through European history. I mean, we've gone through things like the French Revolution since. We always like to follow these paths of the great philosophers and the standard to go, I'm sick of this story, to go from Descartes to Hume to Kant. But we had the French Revolution in there. That was just as important in this characterization of the individual. That lamentable story of how we came to think of minds in a particular way has been developed in ignorance of the manner in which the body has changed over time. The history of the body needs to be considered together with any history of the mind, because what you think a body is something that is itself a product of your time, of the kinds of thinking that are available to you. If you're in a society in which there's well-paid doctors and hospitals, and health insurance and all these good things, you're going to think about your body rather differently than someone who grew up in very different circumstances at a very different time.
And where you grow up culturally, of course,
Yeah,
affects
we're
where
all
you think the
we're,
boundaries of a body might be, or
well,
an individual or whatever.
people are produced locally necessarily, and so I don't traffic in globalizing stories, universalizing stories, stories about all people at all times, or the world. The world is an abstraction I can't really handle. In my personal life as well, I can't handle the idea that there's a world and that we all know what that is and that it's all going on at this time on this day and
Mm-hmm.
everywhere simultaneously.
You mean the way people just talk about the world all the time?
Yeah,
And
they
kind of, yeah.
seem we see ourselves as locked into a temporal evolution, um, and we're snagged with our birthday and our death day are snagged in there, which is a very
Yeah.
funny way to
I mean,
live.
it's interesting we talk about time, and I think what I'm been trying to figure out and is a way to do what you were talking about doing at the beginning is know where we are before we start, like realize what we're doing before we begin the act. Because as you're saying, everything's got so complicated and everyone uses these words in different ways, and we assume that we're all using them in the same way. And even something like Descartes, it depends on what he thought of as I and thinking. And when he says, I think, therefore I am, it could mean something completely different than the way we define those words now. But
Right.
it becomes very hard to slow down and do that. And I'm trying to figure out a way to, like, how can we realize that these things are kind of like those diagrams that you're drawing? These are all just ways we're trying to understand this ongoing process that isn't the world in the way I think you're trying to express, that the world itself is the word we're using to try to talk about together an ongoing process that we can't actually like get a grasp on. But
And
it's always like that, isn't it? In all these
that's going to
subjects.
be a challenge to everybody, and
Yeah.
nobody's going to be master of the whole damn thing. We're done with heroes, but it is a challenge for everybody. And I notice something very special about the way that you're curating your inquiry. You're talking to people. That's
Mm.
so rare. The battlefields on these journal papers, I've had to quit most scientific journals. I won't engage in that nonsense anymore.
Yeah.
The peer-reviewed professional publication in the scientific journals, on the whole, is useless except in technical areas, maybe.
Yeah, and so many
But
people say that now. It's
that's a trouble. You see, science from 1850 on, science got mixed up in the delivery of technology. It became Santa Claus as well, where it was supposed to be natural philosophy was inquiry into things. But it became Santa Claus because everyone wanted it. Well, iPhones and stuff. The technology and science became inseparable. And that, for me, is a disaster. It removed. So natural philosophy, or really inquiring into the nature of things, it's still on some people's agenda. Sean Gallagher, for example, has suggested that in action, it might be well understood as a renewed philosophy of nature. And I wholeheartedly I really like that suggestion because it
hmm.
makes it clear how non-trivial the inquiry is, but also what an enormous distance one must take from common opinion as expressed in text. That's terribly misleading. If you read scientific papers and you think that's the state of the art, oh, that's chatter, textual chatter.
Yeah, Fred, this is really hard because so many people put their lives into these things, and I think it's very connected to what we're trying to get at. And the other subjects we've touched on is that we get stuck in these things, these externalized, even though that's not the right word either, but these systems that we've taken for granted as if they're alive, and that's the only way it is, like kind of the way you're saying you can't even think about the world, but people just refer to it all the time. And it happens in academia where there's like some kind of path that you just assume is the right path until you get so far into that path that you realize, oh, this is just one path and there's many, many more. And but now I've accepted all these references and terms and I have to fight for them, and like you're kind of stuck in it, right? Writing these papers,
Yeah,
you're
but you don't have to
you're on a
solve it.
track.
You don't have to solve it. This is not a solvable problem. This is recognizing that there's um, more to the inquiry, our generalized inquiry, our magnum opus, than you would know from reading the published outputs, or even worse, the published outputs filtered through journalists and popular press. Um, a lot of people don't know that. And so
No,
people go
most people don't know that.
people go around talking about like, what do we know, as if there was some single human agent that knew stuff and had discovered stuff. Like, we know vaccines are good, just take any of the standard scientific shibboleths, we know the earth is round, we know vaccines cure people, and there's no we in that sense, right?
Or there's many we's, but
Infinitely
there's no
many.
one we.
Yeah. What there are, I mean, to critique the professionalized disciplinary publication industry in accord with conventional scientific standard practices is not to critique the activity of the people themselves.
Good. I'm glad you said that.
The
Because a
activity
lot of
of the
people
people,
really care a lot about it, but they get
they do, and
smashed by this process. You
well,
have to publish to get a job or to get a lab or.
I'm always struck. Let's take a really weird discipline, neuroscience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's about brains, I believe. I've got one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm firmly convinced we know very little about the brain, or how to interpret the brain. So the mass of published literature on neuroscience is mostly valueless to me. But the work of individual neuroscientists is of extreme value because they are inquiring into the brain. But they do it each in their own way. The way Ramachandran inquires into the brain is not the way Sophie Scott inquires into the brain. And I'm picking two neuroscientists whose personal approach to it is exemplary and makes me delighted to be associated with it. I just want to distinguish between the activity, the inquiries of genius. I mean, these are brilliant people, right? The language we have for discussing it, information processing in this area of the brain, that's trash.
Yeah, I have this. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had anyone in your life or your family or whatever who's needed all this science from brain studies. I mean, I have, and I see that it actually changes things. Even those people that you said. I mean, it makes a real difference in real lives and in the world. I think we agree on this, but that seems different from the dialogue about what some particular activity in this part of the brain tells us about cognition, which that seems something very different.
Can we do something that's rarely done in this kind of discourse? There's two domains, the clinical domain and the legal domain. They're both relevant to cognitive science. In the legal domain and in the clinical domain, cognitive science questions will arise. They are distinguished domains. They have their own purposes. They are not the generalized inquiry into our nature. They don't need a generalized inquiry into our nature. The job of medicine is healing, taking care of people, attending to what causes them trouble. And people go into medicine with precisely that goal in mind. And that's what that kind of activity is. The job of law is the ordering of society. And it's forced to make arbitrary decisions. I like to point to the magic that happens at midnight on your 18th birthday, where you go from someone who has to be protected to someone who can go out and get drunk and have sex. It's magic. It happens. No one's going to claim that's a natural process, but it's appropriate to the domain of law, and we can see why we do that kind of thing. In the clinical domain, take, for example, EEGs. The EEG, considered as the variation in electrical activity recorded on the scalp, is not a source of information about the brain. I'm sorry, it's just pathetic as you regard it. And people talk about it as if it was a clean signal. That's absolute and utter nonsense. But a lot of clinical experience shows us that this sounds that we get can be correlated with clinically significant distinct conditions. Coma, REM sleep, awake, those kinds of things. That clinical expertise turns this god-awful into something useful.
Yeah, it's looking at patterns, not...
That's very different from the cognitive neuroscientists who insist that they're reading the brain from EEG signals, or that they can tell something about cognition from EEG signals. That's...
No, we can find patterns with our tools, and those patterns can help us understand illness better. That's just what it is. But that gets confused, right, with the public discourse, because I think, to go back to this idea that I was trying to bring in the beginning. We become more aware of ourselves, and we start to understand the knower. We start to think we're a knower, and we want to know how we know. And we've turned our attention on that process as humans in a way that's kind of like really dramatic. We want to know what this is. What is this? What's happening? And that's where it gets confused with consciousness, because we want to know, how do we know that we have a life and that we're thinking? And also that gets messy and tied into a lot of illnesses that are connected to that process. So there's not a clear line between how we can study that and help people, how we can understand it just because we want to understand it. Because as you said, when we just stare, it's fascinating. And there's something that when we go into it, we connect to the world in a deeper way and to each other in a deeper way. So there's all that. And then it gets kind of extracted into what I think you're talking about, these kind of studies of this part of the brain lights up, so you must want some ice cream, and now we can like tell you everything about your thoughts. And, it gets kind of crazy.
We seem to be incapable of separating, of regarding ourselves, well, let's say our understanding of ourselves as competent functioners within a normed society, behaving in certain ways and responding in certain socially sanctioned ways. That is clearly there's an awful lot of externalities of constraints that arise that don't inhere in the body, and the same body under different circumstances would live very differently. When, for example, medicine is called upon to attend to problems of the brain, ignorant of any true knowledge, true essence of the brain, what they're doing is trying to restore functioning. And functioning, that word, moves around between domains and means something completely different. It means something completely different in a physiological register and in you're having difficulty going to work. Yeah, your employer won't like that. You're not functioning anymore if you're not going to work. And employers, I assure you, have nothing to do with brains. But if you want to help someone in their life and they have to go to work, then the part of their functioning is also getting them back on the workplace. So it's not a clean inquiry. Medicine is not clean because people's lives are not clean.
No, but don't you think we've separated as if it's our own fault, right? We won't blame Descartes, even though everyone does, but we have accepted that there's something mental, like thinking and thought, and then there's something physical. And of course, it's not that way. This idea of not being able to go to work is one continuous thing of an issue. It's not that there's some mental issue that you're going to fix and that's separate from the physical job and everything else, like altogether. There's not a world out there that's different from whatever's happening. And yet there are different scales at which you could address that issue, right?
Yeah, but you bring something to the fore there that's very important. You said, oh, man, that mental stuff, that's kind of hard to find. No one can find the mind. We're all worried about the mental. And you said physical as if that was a simple thing. The physical is no more simple than the mental.
No,
Physics
I don't think so.
Is an esoteric discipline concerned with the registration of specific qualities of the specific things we can measure with accuracy. Those things that can be measured with great and repeatable accuracy get into physics, and it's an esoteric discipline. It does not deliver what people mean by physical, which is the reality. It doesn't deliver tables, chairs, things. When doubting Thomas sticks his fingers in Christ's side, that's physical proof he's looking for. You can't do it without a finger and a gushing wound. Yeah, no, that's not physics. The characterizing mental physical as a dichotomy, as we tend to do, hides the fact that physical is just as difficult to grasp as
that's a very good point.
Material matter is not solved and finally explained by chemistry either.
No, but I think that's a really good point. Do you think it's part of it's, for me, it's like back to the, like, let's say the observer and the observed and the means of observing. That's just to take the kind of knowing and put it in that. Because when you have something like physics, it's usually about, I think I've heard you talk about objects, right? Like if we're going to look at a notebook or the coffee machine or something. Okay, your cup. Yeah, your cup. So that's easy for us. We don't like, maybe we see different things or whatever. It doesn't matter. We can agree that we're going to look at that object and we can draw some diagrams and some math and whatever. And it's somehow it's easier for us to understand what the observed thing is and who's observing it. But when it's in your own life, like it's hard. It can feel, I think it's the same thing. I think we're still observing particular regularities that, as you said, are physical and just as hard to grasp, or equally as easy to grasp as that cup if you really look into it. But because we kind of take these big regularities, these chunks of regularities, we just can assume them we don't need to sit here and figure out what that cup is.
Well, if you
Yeah,
want,
it's harder when it's something like your own mental state, right? Even if they're actually just different scales of the very same kind of stuff.
I have no definition of a mental state, and I have a working familiarity with my cup. It's a very good cup, and I can leave it being a simple cup. I can also think it into very, very difficult situations. It's very easy to complicate this picture of a cup.
Oh, yeah.
For example, if you and I and an ant are in the room, how come the cup is present to two of us but not three of us? We all have cinematic imaginations. Which cup am I talking about? Because if you run the film backwards to this cup, it sort of dissolves into clay.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Forward, it
It's
sort of
about time
shatters.
too.
Yeah,
Exactly. Duration.
which particular temporal slice of this cup is the cup?
Yeah.
So it's very easy to complicate that as well. And you don't have to. No, you doing metaphysical speculation on a daily basis to get things done is a stupid way to be. You wouldn't want to
Right.
do it.
Because there are certain regularities and patterns that we can just agree on. So why can't we do that with something like depression or something like, are we doing the same thing with that? Or does that feel
Much
like
harder
something
to agree
different?
what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, that's I get, but because we can't both observe it but we can. I mean, it's just that it's not as easy to observe as that cup, or that we haven't
No, no,
yet
no, no,
kind of.
no, no. Behind the scenes, I mean, the simplicity of the cup, its simple presence in my world, and the fact that I make tea in it every day, and it's not a complicated cup. I have no
No.
trouble with my cup. But I can think my way into trouble with it, because if you look at, well, where do things come from? Where do they go to? What other things must be present for this to also be present?
Mm-hmm.
Things get a bit more difficult. Now, if you come to something like depression, I really don't know what we're talking about. But if we talk about depression, we'll come to agree on something which has to do with matters of urgent concern, but it won't objectify nearly as easily.
Maybe I should compare it to drinking from the cup instead of the cup. Would that be closer?
I don't know, what are you trying to get at?
I'm trying to understand how we can start to understand that this is continuous. I think you agree that mind and life are not different things, they're continuous, right?
I'm
Or,
not sure. I'm not so sure on that. I don't
oh,
know
you're
what.
not so sure anymore.
I'm not sure about anything, Andrea.
That's
Um,
good. That's where we should
I'm,
all be. No one should be sure, but
I'm really no. I kind of made voluntary ignorance my only sacred value.
that's
Um,
Socrates, isn't it? And that's,
yeah.
yeah, you only know that you don't know. I mean, that's the beginning of a certain
Well,
strain of
I
our
like to say,
profession.
if I have to describe what I do, I say I'm an embodied cognitive scientist, and that makes me ignorant, because I definitely have a body. So I have a stake in this game. I'm not convinced that minds are countable, for example. I'm not convinced that when I use the word I, I'm referring to any distinguished entity. I'm using the word I instrumentally for
Mm-hmm.
my purposes and those of my interlocutors. Um, where were we going with this? I just got lost.
Well, I think this,
Ignorance.
yeah, well, and also that you're not sure if you think mind and life is continuous, but
Right. Well,
do you think there's something different that's mental and something different that's physical?
no, that doesn't
Okay,
make sense.
no. So that
Well,
would mean something
but we
like
can
a
have
mental, like
conversations where that is,
depression, which is just
no,
something we
no.
experience,
We
and
can have
something like
conversations.
drinking could be compared.
We can have conversations in which a mental physical divide makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
we can have conversations in which such, I mean, all words are crutches, all concepts are crutches. And to wield them well, we must wield them with specific interlocutors in specific situations. We could make sense of mental, physical under certain circumstances when talking about things.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, is that there are different ways of
Yeah.
assessing whatever is, and we don't even
And
have to agree what it is,
mind and life has become the clarion call of inaction, which is itself under development. It's a whole bunch of people pursuing some very interesting ideas.
Do
And
you
the
count
mind life,
yourself among those, or?
I'm not anything.
Okay.
I'm very interested. I have contributed to the inactive
Yeah.
movement.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
Because
like
others
asking
would
me,
call you like
it's
an
like asking me,
activist.
am I Christian or straight or something like that? No, those belong on forms. You know, I'll tick boxes when I'm going through airports or
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
but it doesn't say anything.
I mean, I really agree with you, Fred. It's just like finding the language to talk about it, right? That's part of what I'm trying to understand with consciousness and cognition. It's not that there is something that can be named, but we have to use words to communicate. We use these representations in order to kind of connect better and hopefully find healthier ways of dealing with the things that do bother us, like depression, like climate change, whatever. So there's real stakes there. We both know that, and we care. And we're trying to understand, take the stance that there's no definite real way of like, you know, freezing these things and saying they're only this. However, we still want to be able to talk about it. And how do we find a way to talk about it and stay aware of that what you brought up at the beginning, that we're just taking the kind of stance here to try to understand it.
Well, I think most of the productive activity in the life of any scientist is going to be talking to other people. There's a reason that conferences were important. Some conferences are ghastly, they're big technical fairs, but the smaller meetings where people love going to meetings to talk because you can have sensible conversations with a few people with whom you share some common terms of reference.
Mhm.
Now, we do have a habit of acting as if discourse could be just put on the page and put out there for everybody and anybody to read. That's an abdication of responsibility. We've learned the value of face-to-face discourse a little anew through the pandemic. The way in which text is being treated with ChatGPT is similar to the way in which the scientific literature has been treated, as if text on a page made sense. No, it doesn't make sense. Text on a page doesn't make sense. We can both read the same book and come away completely different experience. The,
Yeah,
the,
I believe, I mean, that's a very important point, but I think it's something we assume that we've come away with the same experience, which is
yeah,
what's troubling.
nonsense, absolute nonsense.
Yeah, of course we
So
haven't, but it's somehow
text will
assumed
teach
if you
you
read
or
the
not.
same book, you're reading it the same way, but it matters. Like that's kind of why I'm trying to put these it matters everything you've read up to that point, how you're going to read that book.
Yeah.
And we haven't read the same thing, so we're not going to read
And
the
we
book.
haven't read the same things, and everyone pretends like everybody's read the whole canon,
Exactly. Yeah.
which is complete nonsense. Everybody's
Right.
read but as you're reading um, this book that discusses those philosophers and so on, you're getting little bits of the common currency of ideas that swim around, but it's not clearly indexable. I don't know where Plato's really interesting for me, for example.
Hmm.
But I've been dealing with Plato my entire life because Plato has influenced every goddamn thing. I've read Plato years ago and found him kind of boring. I'm reading Plato right now with my mouth open,
Oh,
absolutely
wow.
astonished at
Isn't
what
that,
I'm
I love it
seeing.
when that happens, when it
Yeah,
just,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I was not ready to read Plato before this year. This year, I'm ready to
isn't
read
that
Plato.
spectacular? Wow.
I'm following the Iamblichean curriculum. Iamblichus laid down a curriculum of 12 of Plato's dialogues that were to be read in a particular order.
Oh, where
Um,
do you start?
Alcibiades,
Oh, wow.
and it
Okay.
ends. The last two are, of course, the Timaeus and the Parmenides, the formidable Parmenides.
I don't
Uh,
think I've ever,
I'm
yeah.
only up to the symposium at the moment. But
Okay.
I like that because Iamblichus was very influential. And so this way of reading Plato is the way that a lot of people before me, who's I find very interesting, would have read Plato. So if I'm reading Plato, I'm in Ballybrack, Ireland. I'm never going to get to ancient Greece. It's a long time ago.
Hmm.
So I'm never going to get to any historical truth or any fidelity to some guy called Plato. That's nonsense. If his words are still knocking around, maybe they're capable of knocking me around a little bit. But I'm not kidding myself that I'm tapping into Greek wisdom. I'm making sense from the present.
You're connecting to it, but you're not. It's nothing like whatever it was then, but it's still connected to it somehow.
I know nothing about ancient Greece. I live in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite localist in space and time. And I think what we think of as our knowledge is vastly distributed and much less specific about past times than we believe it to be.
But it sounds like there's something about reading it the way other people have read it that interests you or something. Is that?
Well, I have great respect for Iamblichus. I mean, I've come to recognize that the world of Neoplatonism and Theurgy um, is for me very appealing. But
Well,
these ideas are mixed up. I'm not being true to any tradition because
mm-hmm.
I'm talking about joking characters from olden times, right? There's a new book out by Gregory Shaw who's very good on Theurgy. He previously wrote one called Theurgy and the Soul, which was an explication of Iamblichian Theurgy. Very good book.
Hmm.
But he's just produced a new one and it's going to piss everyone off. They're going to hate it. Its title is inflammatory. It's Hellenic Tantra.
Tantra?
Hellenic Tantra.
Whoa.
Now, of course, everyone purists is immediately going, no, that Tantra belongs over there in India, and you know nothing
Wow.
about it. And the Hellenes, they're the Greeks, and how could you get these things? Because he's giving these historical associations no particular regard. He's
Hmm.
making sense by finding out what he, from his situated perspective, can tell about different ways of approaching altered states of consciousness. Now, you mentioned consciousness, and I said there's lots of people who have studied consciousness, and they include Theurgists, and they include the Tantrics, very much so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, in a way, a, it's a middle finger to anyone who insists on historical purity, that what we're doing now is a direct continuation of the past. No, we're always bringing it forth anew. We're always
I
creating
agree,
from
but there's also a kind of responsibility or something to, because if you're going to
historical,
use some
attending to the
words that other
historical
people are
records.
reading differently, somehow
Yeah,
it might be good to know that there are other people are being affected by those in a way that's whatever.
the only reason that we're in a position to make sense not of a tradition called Hellenic Tantra, there's none. It's just this inflammatory term has just arisen and it does not pick out something historical. But the only reason that we might link Greek ideas that we think with, because we're all of this tradition, we're all Greco-Christian thinkers, with Tantra, is precisely because of scholarship. There's been excellent scholarship of late in all of these areas in the Mediterranean world of late classical era and in tantric studies. There's incredible scholarship. So we're learning new. And then that's why I say I found that science doesn't know anything about consciousness, because I've been looking at some of this stuff and they
Absolutely, yeah.
hardly do know something about consciousness.
Yeah, well, if you come at it from that, then you have the links, right? You're not just using this word. It's maybe you're going through Trungpa or something. I don't know, or maybe you're going back to actual like later texts or something, because those things did meet. And I
Yeah.
think even in like in activism, when you look at Varela and Maturana and cybernetics and how they started opening to other influences, then you can start to trace at least you're not just taking some word and using it without responsibility, I guess.
One reason inaction administered such an impactful kick in the pants to cognitive science is because it drew self-consciously from Buddhist epistemology and not from Greco-Christian epistemology.
Which seems
Greco-Christian
so
apology,
radical and crazy at the time. It seems like when I look back how much people tried to reject that in the kind of,
people didn't necessarily know, those who were
yeah.
Greco-Christian thinkers didn't necessarily know that those Buddhists knew something, or
Yeah.
that there was knowledge. I'm not saying any particular person knows something. In fact,
That there was another way to know what they knew in a way. Like I think about those talks. I'm sure you've read or listened what the ones that Varela did with Dalai Lama and Roche and all those people, right? Way back when they were first starting to do it. And when you're reading those, you just realize it's almost like category theory or something. Like you're seeing two completely different paths to a really similar kind of understanding in terms of not the details, but the pattern, of.
Given that they came from an unusual epistemological starting point, groundlessness,
Mm,
um, they're not experts on Buddhism. Nobody's an expert on Buddhism. There is no Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't exist. What there is a
right. If you
whole
see the
bunch
Buddha, you
of
should
work.
kill him or something,
There's
right?
a yeah, if you come around the Buddha, kill him. But there's a whole um, an immense wealth of dialectic between schools, between thinkers, in sorting these out and articulating their differences and their commonalities and what you're going to get from one school from another school. So it's in no sense trying to get inside some mysterious entity called Buddhism that just doesn't exist. It's learning from these centuries and centuries of dialectic. Of the Indian this context has provided some of the best dialectics humanity has ever had. It's absolutely wonderful. And it's all gone on between schools. It's not within.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even within those traditions that we, from my perspective, I might lump together some huge amount of scholarship, which actually, when you look into that, there's, so many different paths just within that area.
I'm intimidated to be speaking to someone who's read Hegel. I mean, I haven't read Hegel.
Well, you brought up dialectic. You know what I liked about Hegel? It keeps coming up, this idea of the pattern. It was never this kind of details, especially when you look at something like history and the way he gets interpreted. But it was more reading him that he was trying to express a kind of pattern of, instead of the parts, that, and the way you kind of just described those, or the way Varela and the Dalai Lama and all the people that were with them, whose names I can't remember now, unfortunately, the way that their discussion was two different kind of patterns that had gotten to, that were aligning, but not totally getting to a different place, which was actually a place they'd both already been, but they were in a
and there's
way
not
discovering each other.
and there's not one place. The more you dig in, the more you find, oh my
Yeah,
God,
it's
that was a
always
really
multiple.
interesting conversation in 1300 in Tibet. Oh my God, that was really interesting what was going on there.
Yeah,
The,
I find that
the more
very
you dig
exciting though.
in, yeah.
I almost
And
find that to be some kind of motivation for studying all of this. That that discovery of self in another that helps you recognize there is no self. There's this weird, isn't trying, like what you were talking about. There is no Buddhism, and yet Buddhism is kind of a word we use to describe that pattern or path.
yeah,
There's something about that process that can sound kind of crazy or can leave you really even frustrated, I think, because you can't ever nail something down and say that's it.
yeah.
But just the process itself, if you can surf it, you know,
One
uh,
one
it
of my
feels like, oh, this is the reason to be doing this.
Yeah, it's notable that one of my main interlocutors for at least 12 years now has been a local chap here in County Wicklow. He's a Theravadan Buddhist monk.
Oh,
He's 84 years old now.
oh, wow.
He's not within any Buddhist. I mean, he did take order. He has the Buddhist passport. He took vows.
Yeah.
He lived in India for 30 years, studying, and came back here. And he's developed a very idiosyncratic way of approaching these, but he knows an awful lot of stuff that most people just do not know. And drawing richly from him has relativized my own understanding and made it clear that I'm never going to understand things in a manner that's suited for publication in Nature. That doesn't mean I couldn't publish in Nature, but that's not where my understanding is going to lie. My understanding is not in the papers, it's in the questioning.
No, you would have to you could, and you have, I mean, you've published plenty about language and stuff, but you go into that system and you kind of play by those rules and you do it. And there's something about that can be very helpful. But I think when you start really trying to put all these things together in the way, like where you want to see how these different patterns relate to one another, it becomes very hard because then you don't fit into any one of those boxes anymore. And it becomes very hard to constrict all of this other ongoing stuff, encountering, put it into some kind of system when you know what you're doing is
Yeah.
so static.
Well, we can draw here now from Plato, among others,
Mm-hmm.
in the valorization of knowledge. there's a distinction to be made between the best grasp you can get on the world that can be expressed with formalisms and techniques and so on, and noesis, pure and simple, knowing. I'm not going to go so far as to say gnosis,
Okay.
but there is another sense of knowing, which we mean when we say such fancy words as intelligence, which is not articulated, explicated knowledge.
Mm.
It's a state of the knower, if you will,
It's a kind of
to which
a
we aspire.
snapshot or something of.
Hmm. Snapshots have really messed with our imagination, haven't they?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I don't. I've studied. I mean, I've been in different places throughout my life. Like sometimes I remember reading a lot of Buddhist texts and Trungpa even, who before I had heard of Varela, even though I kind of I ended up at Varela through Trungpa, which is a weird thing. But I had studied philosophy, and I don't know. Sometimes you can feel like okay, there's just you can never actually like anything you write is not going to be how it is because you've written it. So it can make you think, why should I write? And I don't think, at least for me, or at this point in my life, that's not the attitude that feels genuine. It feels like I'm giving up or something.
You're right to
Because,
create.
huh?
You're right to create, don't you?
You write to figure things out, to share, to be tested,
To
to
find out what you know, to find out what.
exactly to
I mean,
create a path. You know,
you right,
what if
right,
Plato hadn't written down what Socrates supposedly said? I mean, there's something about this continuity through representations, and by that I mean like literally writing things like books or songs or whatever. Something very important about it, even though we can never actually express the ongoing is.
it doesn't demean our craft at all to make the observation that words on a page are not intrinsically meaningful, but they're meaningful to certain people who have a certain kind of preparedness to encounter them, with whom there's a certain kind of resonance, or for whom they might be significant. They don't have independent meaning. Um, it doesn't in any way diminish our craft. And I love writing and I love making videos and just finding out playing with the ideas and playing in a manner that other people can play with them as well. I
Yeah,
mean, the
your
best thing to
videos are
do,
really good. Do you find that you learn when you're doing when you're doing those videos? I mean, it feels like a creative act sometimes when I watch them.
it is a creative act, but it comes with years of preparation. So that I don't know what I know about something until I'm put on the spot and have to say something about it. And so I'll
Mm-hmm.
try and frame it. And it's the video that forces that. It's a discipline on you
Mm-hmm.
to say something within a specific framework. Um, it's terribly useful, terribly unpredictable though as well. And the idea that one should have an output of any particular kind is just wrong. Um,
But I think I like that word discipline. It does. Isn't there? Do you gain anything? Not gain anything. Like, does that feel like part of a meditative process or a growth process or something when because you're kind of putting yourself out
growth,
there in a way. It's a
growth is not.
risk in the same way a paper is a risk.
Oh, growth is not bad. I don't mind if my papers crash and burn and my videos are never watched. It's not in the slightest bit of importance to me.
I even
Uh,
only mean to yourself. Even I mean, they're actually not. I mean, people like to watch them and people learn from them. So you can, we don't even have to talk about that. But even if you made one and never posted it, let's just say, like, there's something about you're kind of like coming out of yourself in a way to look at yourself can be seen as like risky or something.
but you said it wasn't a growth process, and that's much better because if
Yeah.
I'm forced to put on the spot and now say, after 20 years of thinking about it, make a little statement about what biosemiotics is about, or ecological psychology, or one of those kind of things that cognitive scientists opine upon. What I'm doing is laying down a marker for myself, stabilizing some things that have
Mm-hmm.
arisen for me, some points that have come together, and they would be forgotten if I didn't do this. But it's so that I can move on to the next stage. And when
Mm-hmm.
I've moved on to the next stage, I don't care about it.
Yeah, but you can help other people follow that path. I think,
Yeah,
that's a really beautiful thing that we do for each other. And I guess when I'm like, when we can zoom out and when I think about cognition as navigability, different kinds of ways we've made, and we can all follow very different ones. It's just that we have to realize how many different ways we can always get to any one place, how that place can look so different depending on where you've been before you arrive there. All that
now,
becomes so important and beautiful, but so hard to describe, you know?
one thing I'm acutely aware of, remember that vertical and horizontal axes that
Yeah, aspirational and
yeah,
epistemological.
nearly all the aspirational stories end up creating white professors.
Oh,
They're not really relevant to the I mean, if I'm doing cognitive science and if it's not about a woman who makes carpets and it's not about a fisherman in Africa who catches fish, then it's not for me cognitive science. It's a local thing. But so many of the stories, because of the normative aspect, we all want society to produce these wonderful individuals, and we're going to, we've got this addiction to genius,
yeah.
which is, I find it alienating. Um, I keep coming, I tend to dismiss an awful lot of stuff as white man's fantasy, which is totally unfair because I'm a white man and I share that fantasy in a
Well, there's
sense.
probably some,
I
I don't
mean,
know.
for example, that I dislike the theories of Noam Chomsky, but I recognize his brilliance as well as a thinker.
Oh, yeah.
It's just he's a white man thinking, and so am I,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
No disrespect, Mr. Chomsky. Um, um, that tension is very live for me. And every story that comes up in cognitive science, I'm asking, are we speaking of the perfected individual within our society? Or are we speaking of the latent potential of or maybe cognitive science isn't democratic, Maybe there's
Hmm.
no human atom.
Just monads. No,
Just
but I think that I'm glad you brought that up because I don't know yet how to link it to all the stuff we're talking about, but it's there because uh these trajectories that we're on, we read what is part like as like for example, I'm thinking of just me when I'm younger going into the philosophy department, or we were talking about your freshman classes, and you just take what is given to you, and quite often it is white males. I mean, that's just what it's been, but it doesn't have to be. So it's really kind of more of an observation of how do we start to shift, and because all those other stories, as you were saying, are already there. It's not like they're not there, it's just that not on purpose. A lot of people haven't looked at them and brought them into these very particular places that we're talking about now. I mean, we could go to another part in the world and there would be different things that have been left out. So, but in
don't
these kind of,
underestimate students. Don't underestimate students.
yeah, they're bringing it in themselves
they're
now.
bringing it in and they're bringing their own questioning, their own um, perplexities, their own somewhat cautious evaluation of what they're told their world is and how it works. And one way to regard teaching in this difficult area is to give them the tools to approach these stories without having to finalize themselves, without being told who they are,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
to be able to maintain some kind of critical distance from them and to realize, if I pursue this, I'm pursuing this kind of story. I'm not pursuing truth itself. I'm pursuing this kind of elaborated genre of a story, which features these kinds of characters.
Mm-hmm. I think that seems like a small thing, but that can be very hard to grasp and to do. And it's not something teachers, in my experience, are often aware of, because we kind of think we have to be experts, and then that means that you've learned the only way it is, and you're supposed to now relay that to everyone else. And if it gets questioned, then somehow we've decided that that's like some self that's being questioned. I mean, all of that I feel like is what we're trying to change with all these questions about cognition and consciousness when it comes to how it might actually be productive, right? And you seem to be doing that at the beginning, but um, do you think that's actually like typical? I mean, do you see other people doing that too in in the profession of teaching about these
I
topics?
no longer go to other people's classes very often,
Yeah, but
unfortunately.
You must kind of be aware of it or hear what your students say or.
No, I'm in a technical department where technical subjects are taught with big industry commitments, with exact closed book exams and so on. And I'm very, very fortunate that the cognitive science program is allowed to exist there with this very radically different way of doing things. There is, rather than professing to be, you see, that's what a professor does, is professing, right? Professing to be an expert would suggest that you know a lot of stuff, but sharing the experience of picking up many stories, considering them, taking something from them and leaving them behind again, that kind of experience can be shared, I think, as long as you don't claim to know too much. And then that way the students hopefully become co-inquirers.
Yeah, that would be the best.
Yeah.
I mean, that's often the best experience as a student that I remember.
Yeah.
And probably as a teacher too, when you're, participating in something together rather than playing a role.
There's another thing which happens. Cognitive science is full of jargon. Oh, God help us. And philosophy. Oh, God help us. I do like, where possible, to avoid obfuscation, even if that means limiting the epistemic reach. And I've been greatly helped in this. Pure chance, you asked him about my trajectory, but by pure chance, when I was a graduate student, I got accepted into a linguistics department and computer science. I forget which I was in linguistics and theory, but I was mainly in computer science. And I'd sworn off phonetics as an undergraduate. I didn't like phonetics. I wanted to get to the concepts. But I was working with a phonetician there who was taking these dynamical ideas, and I played with the tools we had, and had people saying silly phrases in time with a metronome, because you could measure something, and if you can measure something, you can write something about it. Measurement is the great unaddressed problem, but at least I could measure something. And it wasn't until after my PhD and after successive failed grant applications that I understood what I was studying, and I stopped having people speak with metronomes. And then in the laboratory I had people speak with people. That yielded lots of really interesting results. And then I just dropped the laboratory because I realized what I was studying I didn't need a laboratory for, because people are doing this. And I'd actually uncovered something empirical in the world that you could go out and study. Joint speech, when people make the same sounds at the same time, is an empirical object, easy to find in everyone's world. Unlike almost every other cognitive scientist, I can say when I'm studying, it's full of mystery as to what's going on in joint speech. Sometimes you need a completely inhuman register to understand what's going on. It's not about persons sometimes.
Can you give me an example of that? This is something people associate with you a lot in your papers, the joint speech. So maybe we could just really quick, so it's like something like that happens in these, you name places like sports events or protests, or where people are speaking the same thing or at the same time, right? The same rhythm.
Joint speech is, there was no science of it, and there still is basically no science of it, and yet it's very easy to study scientifically, as long as you drop the assumption that you know what the knower is, or the known, or the means of knowing. That you with a suitably ignorant standpoint, there's way more to see. So, for example, a biologist might look at joint speech and go, oh, hang on, I've been studying giraffes and platypuses, and here's this animal. What are they doing? First, you must recognize what speech is from a biological point of view. Exquisitely controlled exhalation. And now you come across a species that engages in joint, synchronized, exquisitely controlled respiration. See, I didn't have to appeal to any minds or any mental, physical crap there. I'm just talking about animals. Exquisitely controlled, synchronous respiration. David Attenborough would be like, we found the ultimate animal. So that's from a biologist's point of view. That's really, really interesting.
I guess other animals do it too, though. So not just human animals.
No, there's very few parallels. Very few parallels. There's some. interesting
I was just
parallel.
thinking about like dogs or wolves or something howling together, but maybe they
Yeah,
don't.
yeah,
I don't know.
and there's various things with macaques and so on.
Mm.
There's a couple of instances of chimpanzees being caught hooting together, but
Mhm.
there's no strong parallel. Just as
But it's not like chanting at a sports match. I mean,
just
that's,
like yeah,
yeah,
just like
that
every
just
aspect of language tends
arises.
to feature in some respect in animal communication as well. So joint speech has shadows in other animals, but is particular. It's as for my money, it's as strong a hallmark of a distinguished species worth studying from a biological point of view as our enlarged forebrain that we seem to value so much. The
Did
enlarged
you
forebrain.
did you coin that word, the or that phrase? Do you call it a phrase? Joint speech. Those two words
Yeah,
together.
yeah. Because I needed to make the definition unassailable. People make people, we have to be able to find people making the same sounds at the same time. I dropped over the years, I dropped all reference to texts, words, sentences, making the same sounds at the same time. Um, Another thing that's happened, so this was a paper I published fairly recently, worked with Luciana Longo. We had been in Jerusalem, and there's a lot of chanting in Israel, you know. And I've been just looking at anywhere I can see, I notice people saying the same thing at the same time. I'm interested in it. And individual observations suddenly reveal worlds. But if we drop the assumptions of psychology completely, I'm not a psychologist. Um, if we drop if we get over the eternal fight between sociology and psychology, sociologists for 100 years have been trying to get people to accept things as real that they insist on making individualized psychological things. Social phenomena are perfectly real and they have their own ontological dignity. If we just get over all that and be as ignorant as we can be, I've been staring and looking at joint speech, and in that observation, from that ignorant point, four domains crop out, and they're not predicted by any sociological, cultural, anthropological, or psychological theory. And those, roughly adumbrated, are the domain of ritual, which includes all prayer, right? All, I mean, ritual is huge.
Oh yeah.
How
Hmm.
big is ritual? Protest, yes. It's entirely generic, and it doesn't matter what language we're speaking. It doesn't matter what part of the world we are. If there's protesting going on, there'll be chanting going on.
Yeah. Hmm.
Football is a weird one, um, because these giant stadiums that are so conducive to chanting are a relatively recent phenomenon. They arose in the 19th century after a long hiatus. The Romans had them in the Colosseum, but
Hmm.
then these big stadium events went away for
Oh,
2,000
I never
years.
thought about that. Wow.
Yeah.
So ritual, protest, and sport, is
Sport
that okay?
and primary education.
What? Primary
Yes,
education.
primary education. And here I need to say I'm trying to peer through the weeds. What we found was in Western classrooms, the chanting is the mathematics. Its mathematics tables are chanted.
Hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
true
A, B,
anywhere
C,
that
D, E, F, G, your
Western kind of
alphabet too.
still, there's more chanting that goes on, but
Hmm.
the, the maths is very important because it's a sacred value of a particular kind of educational system. And when we enlarge our focus and look at madrasas, we find chanting as well, and they're chanting the Quran. And when you now compare the chanting of mathematics and the chanting of the Quran, something really interesting happens. You see the imposition of the sacred values of the society being stamped on the children. And it becomes evident in the even studying the overt public empirical forms, what you can observe in, for example, madrasas. The Quran is taught in many countries in which Arabic is not the native language, or where the children do not even speak Arabic. And they're taught to chant the Quran and they're not taught Arabic. They're not taught what it means. They're taught to chant it because the chanting is itself the performance that's valued. There's a great high regard for someone who can chant the Quran from memory in Islam. And we, in our little world, do the same thing with this bloody mathematics, that calculating skill. Don't mistake the glorious domain of mathematics for that which is going on chanting, calculating, chanting your sums. I'm crap at my sums. I was crap at my sums in primary school. I'm still crap at my sums. That's not mathematics. But it is held to be mathematics in the same way that once you can chant the Quran, you're doing something, you're doing the right kind of thing. If you're
So you're
from
saying all that is primary education? Like you're
no,
basically
no,
saying our
I'm
education
trying
as
to
young
ignore most
people?
aspects of primary education and point out that across such culturally diverse situations, primary education is a theater in which we see the sacred values that the children are supposed to embody
Okay.
arising through chanting.
What
And
about
all that's
song, singing? What is that? Just not singing is something else, or
you say singing, and now I'm going, well, which singing? Where's oh, no, there's tons of singing. Singing is wonderful. Singing is all kinds of things.
is it joint speech when we just break into song together?
Oh
Or is
yeah,
it? I guess we've learned
oh
it before.
that's very important when you study joint speech. The distinction between speaking and singing goes out the door because you find everything on a continuum. All
That's
you
interesting.
find raucous, cacophonous, and you find sublime, harmonious. You've got Hildegard from Bingen, and you've got our attempts to sing Happy Birthday over Zoom. You know, they're all joint speech. Joint speech, when I say chant, people start to get into hippie mode and think of it as positively valenced, and I point out it's the natural language of fascism, North
Oh
Korean
gosh.
propaganda, Nuremberg rallies. Joint speech turns out to carry all these associations with it and to open up things. You can
Mm-hmm.
see things in a new light precisely because it's been articulated without reference to the assumptions of the formed person or the society in which that the social structures and cultural framing within which everyone lives.
Well, it's a kind of an alignment of spatiotemporal patterns, so it could be used in all kind of ways in terms of
Oh, it is,
motivating.
and those four big domains um, do not by any means draw a circle around joint speech.
But this is really interesting because this seems like a whole, I mean, it's basically like you've created what I would imagine would be like a whole discipline of study, but you've just kind of pushed it away and left it or something. I mean, that's a really big thing there, joint speech that you observed and put a term on. And I could even think like there's all this hyper scanning now where you have two people in fMRI, you know, and you see how their brains, I mean, I know you don't like this stuff, but you could even look at the body. I mean, there's so much richness kind of in that, but I feel like you've just left it or something.
Those tools in the right hands can be used to ask sensible questions. Those tools do not by themselves deliver sensible results.
No, they're
And
just
so
ways of
Piscott
looking at
before is a
patterns.
neuroscientist who works within the computational cognitive neuroscientific paradigm, which is an absolute genius. And she has a genius for the human, and she studies respiration and vocalization in all its manifest varieties, not restricted to saying, take a pack of cards or any of the stupid sentences we ask people to do. So she studies laughter and she studies hiccups and she
Oh
studies
yeah. Could you say your name one more time?
Sophie Scott.
Sophie Scott.
And she figured out a way that we could use fMRI to study chanting. When you're on your own in the scanner, you're not allowed to move.
Hmm,
And
that's
good luck
wild.
trying to capture any of the passion that is naturally, you've killed chant when you put someone in a scanner, but there's a shard left. And her genius allowed us to bring out that shard and show what we showed in this study was we had a paradigm. She's absolute master of the techniques. So while you're not allowed to move in the scanner, what the scanner is registering in fMRI is, of course, blood flow. Blood flow is very slow. And so you do something, and about 3 or 4 seconds later, there's an alteration to blood flow. So that's just enough time to say a sentence, and then we scan while you're quiet. So that was brilliant.
Ah, right. Okay. That's smart.
And then we could hook them up with microphones. There are special microphones you can use in here. So we could hook them up with an experimenter and get them to repeat something in time, in synchrony with the experimenter. What we did was we had recordings of the experimenter and we had the live experimenter. And we never told the subjects of that there might be recordings or there might be that what they were
Okay.
listening to might be a recording. Nobody noticed, but there was a manifest difference in blood flow associated with being in live reciprocal interaction with a real person.
Oh, fascinating.
And that
Wow.
was subconscious. So these things that doesn't mean we understand the brain. We're looking at changes in blood flow, but it shows that even with this tool, or specifically with this tool, you can see the reality of the intersubjective connection that inheres in this kind of speaking. Because if you're speaking with a recording, you're not modifying the recording. If you're speaking with another speaker, you're modifying each other. You're in a handshake.
And that could tell us a lot about why we might actually need physical presence, or maybe it could tell us something about how when one person is in a particular state, being around a person of another kind of state could help them. I mean, there's all kind of practical
Yeah.
things that if you just look at the patterns could be helpful, even for what we were talking about earlier with these trying to understand what depression is or something. You could understand it without needing to understand it.
When the pandemic hit, we all became Zoom creatures. And long before that, about 10 years before that, something came to me in a dream, like one of those periodic tables and benzene ring things. I got up in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and said out loud, "You can't chant over Skype."
Wow. Did you wake up and write it down, or you just remember it? Or
I remembered it, went in the next day and checked it, and I found you couldn't chant over Skype. And I had figured out that there was a fundamental problem with the lags that breaks this reciprocity that's so absolutely essential.
Fascinating. Wow,
And I
that's
was
really
correct. And I've worked on this with a few colleagues for about 15 years now. There is a fundamental limitation. There's a reason you can't sing Happy Birthday together, even despite your tolerance for cacophony and howls. In that particular situation, there's a principled, fundamental, logical reason you can't chant over these networks, precisely because the reciprocity inheres in the activity. The direct connection inheres in the activity. Any temporal lag sunders it.
Wow, that's a beautiful idea for embodied cognition approaches, I think, but also just for understanding that technology is a tool. It's not a body.
Yeah. And we make do with Zoom. We can do all kinds of things. I mean, people do yoga. I've done dancing classes over Zoom. You know,
Oh yeah, sure, and it's a
amazing
wonderful
what you
thing.
can squeeze through it. Yeah. No, but that was learning something, not about how should we fix Zoom, but learning something about the essence of what's going on when people synchronize, when people engage in this collective enactment of something. They are literally not separate. That's why my non-psychological stance and my interest in Buddhism means, you see things if you stop thinking of the person as this distinguished, separate thing.
Well, something like that shows us how porous or the boundaries change, right? I mean,
yeah, they're fluid. We flow.
Yeah, and I think of something like Elias Canetti's writing about crowds, or
Yep.
I mean, there's like very real consequences of if having a better understanding of that. Something like sports, but also you brought up the Nazis and how, these things are almost you almost get put into a pattern, or you place yourself into a pattern. And if you had an observation in the way of like the knower looking at the known, something about that stance again that we've been trying to talk about. There's something about science and what you're doing that's allowing another way of having that stance.
There's a chap in Stanford University, Sepp Gumbrecht. What's his Sepp is his familiar name? Hans, I think, Gumbrecht. And he wrote a book called Crowds.
Okay.
Which is extremely good. He's a football supporter.
Oh.
And he was writing about being a football supporter in stadiums. And he's writing about the manner in which Canetti and many others have discussed these kinds of enthusiasms, collective enthusiasms, and the manner in which they have been systematically demonized in the entire literature. Almost nobody has given them any respect. And he doesn't shy away from noting the proximity of violence in such situations. The violence that inheres in football is part of football, I'm afraid. You can't get rid of it. You can't get rid of it and still have this mass heaving, enthusiastic activity. I'm sorry, we are partly violent. That is what happens when this energy flows. It's not to be explained in terms of individual people and their little minds and their little hopes.
I guess I would hope that we could, I don't think you could get rid of the energy, but you could maybe channel it into some sort of fighting that's not so harmful.
Well,
But
football's going to be football. And I mean, the monks in my favorite Benedictine Abbey have channeled it. They've channeled it into singing the praises of God.
some would
Yes,
say sports is a channel of the energies of war. I mean, I don't know. That sounds really generalized and probably not
well,
quite right, but there are ways we've channeled kind of things that come together when we're together and how overpowering it can get. We do channel it into something like song or chant or sports or towards
channeling,
doing something better with
channeling,
it.
channeling is an interesting way to put it. Um, there would be there's a way of regarding this which is quite difficult because to express because people can't stop believing in themselves. I'm afraid their own stories. But the energies that arise when people come together and commune and assemble, those are the words I'm using for it now.
Yeah,
Commune,
I was thinking
assembly.
about church too and what
Yeah,
people get out of it.
yeah, communion and assembly. And we assemble and commune in different ways. And when we do, there is an energy there which has its own ontological force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something is coming into being and it will dissipate or it will be repeated. And it might, some of these events come together and they are repeated over thousands of years. The Eucharist has been celebrated over thousands of years.
Mm.
Some of
Yeah.
them come together and they go away again. Your average protest does this. Some of those protests persist. So the persistence of these patterns over time does not speak of individuals, does not speak of individual lives. It speaks of human creative energies, but they're the kind that wipe out humans as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I guess that's what I was trying to say that um we could get into kind of a a frenzy or something of just, what is it? Apollo's not Apollo, but Bachian or what's the word? The where you just sort of it's
Bacchanalian
almost
frenzy.
yes, exactly. I mean, we could I guess
Yeah.
that could be
Great fun, isn't it? I mean, that's another thing about joint speech. Everyone loves it, man. There's nothing so good as hooting together with your mates. I
I
We had
mean,
campfire songs. It was brilliant, you know. It was
yeah, do you see the connection between what we were talking about earlier? Like there's some kind of meaning in this in a really practical way of
yeah,
we are like you said, nobody can stop believing in themselves, but in a way, I feel like we're trying to expand our idea of self, even if that I mean, you could go the other way too and say there is no self. There's in a way, I feel like those are going in a similar direction. And something like joint speech is helpful, isn't it? If you can and something like studying joint speech becomes very helpful too because it gives you a way of looking at what's happening and starting to be like it gives you a way to start to understand yourself as both scaled much smaller and scaled much wider, that there's not a self like
yeah,
me,
yeah,
but there is a kind of patterning, right? That at sometimes I'm the group, at sometimes I'm not, you know, I'm less than the just this outline of the body or whatever. There's something about that that I think could be really helpful for us. Maybe that's what science can help us do too, is just get a vision of it, you know?
yeah, yeah. And listen, science is not a closed domain. There's all kinds of work goes on. There's all kinds of conversations that go on. They're not all in the academy, even,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm
Yeah.
more interested now in groups of thinkers who span the academy and other ways of engaging with the world, who are interested in practice, collective or individual, or who are just um, not regarding the academy as the sole producer of knowledge. That's the white professor view, right?
Yeah, well, that's what, I try to talk about beyond dichotomy, which I mean, of course, it's a bit silly beyond dichotomy, but in a way, somehow something like Buddhism or spirituality or coming at this topic from that angle would seem like it's, usually you're not supposed to talk about those kind of things if you're a scientist, or at least that was once the stance. But I feel like we're trying to learn that you can take different stances without collapsing them into each other and saying that in the same way of mental and physical we were trying to talk about, it's just different ways of assessing whatever all this is. And they're different paths and you end up in different places and you can use them in different ways, and there's different kind of rigor. But like, why can't they all be ways for us, you know?
Well, science is not a thing. Science is distributed activity. It goes on in all kinds of ways. There are forms of scientific forms that include scientific discussion and scientific intervention that leave open an awful lot of interpretive possibilities that do not finalize and nail things down, or don't aspire to being the last word, but are means of thinking things through in the present. I think in science, you always have to ask yourself, who are you speaking with? The idea, the dead mode of publication is you publish a paper and it goes out there and it changes the world. That's just a bit silly. When you write something, it's going to be read by specific people, and it's going to engender, hopefully, specific kinds of conversations and specific kinds of discourses. So you need to be aware of who you're engaging with and what's possible in specific forms of engagement. And I'd like to flag one thing here that's signally absent from most people's understanding of science, and I don't think it should be, which is human potential. We do not know of what we are capable. We are very good at spotting breakdowns, and most of the discourse in cognition is all about desperately trying to keep the bike on the road. It's about desperately not failing.
Yeah.
We have no vocabulary for the positive in us, for the enormous capacity we have to exist and as well as we possibly can. Indeed, such enthusiasms have been hunted down, stamped, put in the asylums. They're not tolerated. Any science that's closed with regards to the unknown territory of human potential, well, it might be good for fixing dishwashers, but that's it. It's not good for self-inquiry.
That's what people sort of have thought. But as you were saying that, I was thinking of Thoreau, and enthusiasm is a supernatural serenity. In a way, we get into science, or when I was young, I mean, the reason I wanted to understand philosophy and science was that enthusiasm and that motivation that you just described. But then you have to apply a certain kind of rigor, and that's why critical thinking is so important. There is a difference between saying something is science and doing the science. And it can be hard to learn that. Even something like critical thinking, which is so important, but then you can just get sucked into analytical philosophy where you're arguing about stuff that you don't care about anymore just for the sake of winning an argument. And it can get confusing, can't it, once you dig into it?
It absolutely can. And there's all kinds of misleading representations of science that can rapidly lead you to misunderstand things. For example, quantitative scientific psychology is the most desperate of domains. Terrible, terrible domain.
Can you say more? I'm not sure. What do you mean?
Well, yeah, cognitive psychology, the idea that you can measure people's mental capacity or study their cognition
with metrics
in the larger sense through laboratory tasks. And the laboratory tasks are insane. And we don't even know when is the right time to observe a person. The assumption that you can take a person with all their full potential and study them in a laboratory is already to have gone.
Yeah, I write about that in my master a little bit. Like, just the fact that we set up an experiment in a certain way, and then we assume that.
And then you do things like
stimulus response is the way to do it. I mean, and that we've learned something. It's all very, very needs reevaluation.
There's an elaborated world of theories of visual perception and cognitive neuroscience, and it's founded upon the practice of taking people in, stopping them being people, sitting them down in a chair, sticking a screen in front of their face, putting images on the screen. They didn't even fucking notice that there's an image there.
Yeah, and then parameterizing a very particular pixelated part of the brain to look at. It's all very weird.
The face area has been identified by people forced to stare at what is essentially the face of Christ in a digital image form on a screen. Interestingly, Sean Gallagher and I, within a week or two of each other, both sort of pleaded in public, would you mistake an image of a tiger for the presence of a tiger? And you obviously wouldn't. No. But these psychologists are happy to confuse an image of a face with the presence of a person.
Yeah. And then it's so easy to do. And then confuse the image of a brain with the brain. The snapshot of some activity in a little part of the brain has then been taken as a brain when we look at the picture of it in the publication.
Yeah, yeah.
This is not a brain.
Images have us ruined.
It's very tricky. I mean, you really have to catch yourself, you know?
And our capacity to make images far outstrips our ability to understand what we're doing as we do so. I'll just point out that the images that everyone wags their tail about, the fMRI ones, are not about the brain, they're about blood.
Yeah, and they're not the brain, but we say they're the brain.
There's a very useful thing that someday maybe somebody will learn from. In the articulated discourses that underpin a lot of Buddhist and Hindu epistemology, the mind is not a thing. It's the heart mind, chitta. That is, the organ of the heart and the organ of the brain have not been separated, and there's recognition that all cognition is passionate. All cognition is passionate. We have artificially separated the two. When we're looking at fMRI, we're seeing that passion, but what we're not seeing is the sparky logical bits that Warren McCullough dreamt up.
Yeah, I really think it's the most subtle, but the most dangerous confusion we have right now. And it is kind of this map for the territory thing that people talk about, but you know, where we really, really do this all the time. And it's hard to catch, but we're learning it, I think, how to catch ourselves.
Coming back to that sometimes useful distinction between mental and physical, we again mislead ourselves if we think all the mystery lies in the mind. A lot of the stories that unfold depend in the first place on objectification of the body in a particular register. The allopathic body constructed by clinical medicine is a creature born in the fear of death. It's not the body. It's one way of regarding the body with the specific purposes of the medical industry in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, God knows we all need that kind of thing, but the fact that we think that's the body leaves us with all these puzzles about mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so subtle, it's just even hard to talk about, because when you think of the body, you almost think of all those anatomical drawings and stuff, and you think that's everything, but those are themselves sort of sketches of sketches, and we've really kind of it's very hard to catch all of those mistakes we've made in terms of assuming representations for realities.
You couldn't, but when you realize that every articulated story of ourselves has its commitments, needs to be elaborated and explored as far as it goes, but needs to be capable of being unwound back to our primary ignorance. If we're not capable of doing that, we'll go extinct, we'll kill ourselves. If we can constantly unwind the stories so that we can retell them, there must be something creative in our thinking. Our thinking is not finalizing.
Right.
It's
I hope we're getting there with certain. You brought up dynamics and all the stuff that you were studying in the 90s, like the mathematics and stuff. Those are representations, but at least we're trying to have, you know, with category theory, complex systems, networks, we're trying to at least start to understand how we might do what you just said representationally. Like look at things from many different positions, see how depending on which node or trajectory you followed in which landscape, it all is going to align a little bit differently, even though it's continuous patterning. Mathematics can kind of maybe help us start to understand that, but then like this most essential thing just seems almost like what you've seemed to have learned in something like Buddhism, being able to recognize that those are representations, not in your brain and body, just of a process that you will never represent fully.
Well, just like the thing that the children are chanting in the classrooms is not really mathematics.
Right.
Most discussion of mathematics is not really about mathematics. It's about efficient calculation within specific domains that leads to utilizable results. And I pointed back to the association of the cogito with the zero on the coordinate plane. In other words, there's a conundrum, a paradox at the very heart of mathematics itself, which is our paradox as thinkers.
Yeah, because Yeah, exactly. It's hard not to reject the representations or the drawings or reject Descartes because he did it,
Yeah,
because we still think in that either or mindset instead of this scaled, nested, open mindset, which I think we're trying to get to. It's,
you can't be
you know,
completely open. You make some choices, you follow some story, you find what can be done, but you remember that you made those choices, and we're very good at forgetting that we made those choices. We're very good at forgetting, for example, that the Cartesian coordinate system completely radically changed geometry, made it metric, and it gave one particular point a distinguished role. That was not geometry before then. It
no,
turned
and
out to be
it's not
very
the only way of
useful.
doing it either, but we also
But
kind of
people
assume
seem
that.
to think that all the mysteries around um, change and time and space kind of went away when the calculus was invented. No, they didn't.
They opened up further, but it gave us a way
Well,
to notice they were
we
there.
developed symbolic competence to solve problems that involve rates of change and curvatures and so on. That's true, but the fundamental questions you need to recognize. Well, it is of use to recognize that those questions didn't go away and that such fundamental questions can trouble us right now, right here, sitting here.
Yeah, and that's that linear way of thinking too, that for me is I find myself doing it even when I try to catch myself doing it, where you think there's a beginning and an end and there's one way, and but actually all that we learn and all that we create perpetuates what's possible. There's no linear beginning and end. You're not going to get to the end of this. I mean, that's not how it exists as something that's beyond that already. So
We fall in love with
yeah,
our stories, though, and forget that we told them.
yeah. And in some of that we have to do just because it's just so much. But part of it's also why we do have these representations that we've now started to take as reality, because we want to pass things on. And the best way to be able to forget but still have it is write it down or put it into a math problem or something. But anyway, I think we've been talking now for, oh my gosh, almost 2 hours. So we should probably take a break and have some dinner or something. But
Did we finish it?
I don't know. Is there anything I mean, we should just talk again at some point because we
We
didn't
should
even
just
really
talk
get into
again. Yeah,
cognition and
it's very fun.
consciousness.
I value this, Andrea, because this is for me that this is the kind of inquiry I want to do, is talking to people, talking through these things, find out where
Yeah.
I'm nuts, where you're nuts, where we're both ignorant, what have we learned.
Yeah, me
It's not
too.
to solve the world's problems or find the answers, but be better prepared to ask the questions and look into things.
Yeah, and just let it matter and let it be a learning process, For me, that it keeps me motivated and also helps me understand where my blind spots are, because it's, you
Hmm.
can't really see unless you try and talk about it. So
I've,
thank
I've
you for helping me with that.
I ordered your book on the Volkswagen Bug. I'm waiting.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
I thought it
I'm
was a
not
very
sure,
interesting
but
thing to have. I'm sure I'll have something to say about it next time we talk.
yeah, well, I mean, it would be interesting at some point. Maybe we're still a few conversations away, but all this does kind of relate to how we move through the world for me, um and very similar to what we were talking about in terms of the vehicles that we create in the ways
Yeah.
we've talked about on this. I also think all that's tied together. I think we could get there because it connects to some of the stuff that I've seen you do too, but let's just talk again soon and see what
Yeah.
happens. How about that? Maybe
Very,
we
very
can
good.
try and do it, every now and then.
Sure, we'll bump into each other at the Sarah Reading Group if that carries on, right?
I'm going to India, by the way. I meant to say for the first time. I really appreciate this.
And
I
I'll
hope
see
you have
you
a
in
good
Oslo.
evening.
I'll see you in Oslo next
See you in
then.
Oslo, and then we'll
And
plan our next
there's more
conversation.
conversations to come.
Okay, cool. Thank
Okay,
you.
Andrea, take care.
Much gratitude.
Yep. Bye.